All right, well, welcome everyone to our Lean Startup for the Enterprise Meetup, number 3 here. My name is Arlen Bankston. I'm going to be doing a quick presentation on an introduction to Lean Startup for the Enterprise. So we're going to be looking at some of the basic principles of Lean Startup. And for those of you who've got some experience, I'd be happy to hear your take on my take and what you think of it. And we'll be talking just a little bit about how it differs from the startup to the enterprise. And we'll kick it over to Casey for a little deeper dive. So a little bit about me. I'm a co-founder of LitheSpeed, in fact. Several of you have met my business partner, Sanjeev. So I've been doing Agile, Lean, and various flavors for 13, 14 years at this point. You know, have a big background in it. I was also originally a user experience person, and I did a lot of product management, in fact. So I found this Lean startup stuff to be quite apropos for my background and really to align closely with my experience. So here's what we're going to be talking about. A little bit about Agile product management and the challenges that are often faced there, and then diving into some of the details of the Lean startup. So let's start with this. We've got an idea here, right? This is an example of incremental development, which is what a lot of people view methods like Scrum and XP and so on as in fact being. They're incremental approaches, and of course they are, but what's wrong with that? If you look at this picture, in order to do that, what would you have to have? You have to already know what you're building, right? I mean, having the entire end result perfectly in mind is necessary in order to be able to slice it in this fashion. So we do, of course, do incremental development in Agile. We do. But we also, and perhaps even more so, do iterative development. So in this case, we've got a little bit of a different picture emerging here. Here, we're starting out with a rough idea. And we can see there's some problems with it. So we're gradually making it better here. This is about the face. So let's soften the background. Let's put her hand in her lap. Let's take that blonde hair and that bright salmon outfit and let's mute it out a little bit because we'd like the focus to be here. And once we're happy with it, then we can flesh it out and spend our energies polishing off the last bits of it. This is iteration. Iteration is learning. And as we'll see, that's really much of the point of these methods. It's not just to build stuff, it's to learn that we're building the right stuff in the first place, and for the right people, and the right way. Right, so we're looking at a little bit of a combination of this iteration and increment. And instead of just having a straight plan to go from here to there, we're kind of assuming we don't know some things. You know, and it depends on the project, of course, on where and what we don't know, but this all comes down to the fact that we're not going to be following some rigid plan and just going from here to there because we don't know where there is. We're going to be using the methods themselves and the things we build to learn more about what to build, how to build it, and who for. And here's where the Lean startup comes in. First of all, Lean. There's some Lean in the Lean startup, I think, but a lot of the principles are a little deeper than they are surfaced, really. Lean, of course, comes from manufacturing originally. It was a term coined in a book called Lean Thinking by a couple of gentlemen who named, their names escaped me at the moment, I'm sorry, but they wrote The Machine That Changed the World, and then they wrote Lean Thinking, and they were describing the Toyota production system. And it boils down to these basic principles. We're going to build just what our customer really wants, right? While we're doing it, we're going to make sure that our processes are well understood and in fact fairly bulletproof by always looking for ways to improve them. Trying to build quality in the processes instead of having inspections at the end of the line. We're going to try to smooth out our demand, come to standard ways of doing things, and try to always get better. That's what Kaizen is, change for the better. Well, all this comes down to it, as ensconced in the Lean startup practice and the other Agile methods, it's about really just focusing on doing as little as possible to get to where we need to go. Just trying the basic elements to learn that we're in fact building the right product, targeting the right audiences, and so forth. And that's where a lot of the techniques come from. So really the Lean startup as it is an amalgam of a lot of things that preceded it. A lot of it is Agile, right? I mean, the development process really doesn't terribly differ from what people have already done in XP and Scrum. It hasn't introduced anything new from that perspective, really. What it did do, Steve Blank, famous entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, really focused on customer development as a key element. He said, instead of just going out there and trying to sell something to people, let's find some people with a spark of interest and then try to really get them more interested in it by engaging with them, asking for their feedback, building things they need, responding rapidly to that feedback that they give us. And in that way, we can essentially grow new customer bases for ourselves. He said, this is an interesting idea. And then you've got this guy named Alex Osterwalder came up with, he has something called a business model canvas, which fundamentally is like it's like a project charter. It's a one-page overview of, hey, here's what we want to do with the project. But it's a dynamic project charter, unlike a business case where you say, we're going to build this and 10 million people sign up next month. We're really saying, you know, that's a guess. They may or may not, in fact, sign up next month. So let's put it out there as a guess, and let's amend it as time goes forward. Let's assume it's a hypothesis, and then go forward and adapt that hypothesis as we build things and learn more. And Eric Ries is a guy who really took all these ideas. Steve Blank was his mentor, really, originally. He worked with Alex a little bit, pulled it all together, and wrote a book called The Lean Startup, which is where this term, in fact, originated. Just only a couple of years ago now, or a few years ago, that this has gained any momentum. And it boils down to this, a basic cycle. We build, measure, and learn, right? We build, and that generates, generates products, and that measuring generates data. We learn, we get new ideas. Simple cycle, really much the same thing, again, that you see in other agile methods. They're just a little more explicit with the experimentation aspect of things. So if you really take the essence of the method here, it's a few elements. We're saying that this is an experiment. Every sprint you do, every iteration, everything you build is an experiment. You're building it and you think that when you build it, people are going to react to it in this fashion. You're testing that, right? And you're trying to test it in as direct a fashion as possible by actually putting out there, having people use it, rather than just testing on the side. It's saying, let's try to interface with our customers more directly. Instead of going and just maybe interviewing one every now and again, let's go watch them at work. Let's do some ethnographic observation. Let's make sure that we really understand how, in fact, they're working so we can build better products for them. And as we go on, we want to introduce some tools that allow us to do more thoughtful release planning and road mapping and pivoting, so to speak, or changing direction with our product as we move forward. So, if you look at, again, going back to lean core principles here. This isn't from the Lean Startup as such. This is core lean. If you think of lean, what do you think of? What's a word that comes to mind? Lean is about
production line, frequent feedback,
production line,
feedback,
supply chain. I often, when I ask people this, like historically, they've usually said it's about reducing waste, right? It's about eliminating waste. Buddha, that's part of the principle. It's the last part of the lean canon here, right? I mean, it is something you do, but only after you do these other couple of things. The first objective of lean is, in fact, to find out what your customer wants in the first place. There's no point in building things efficiently or in a more optimal fashion if nobody wants it to begin with. So finding the value, like what is it we need to build, is first and foremost, and that's what you're trying to achieve. Once you've got that, now we can begin looking at establishing essentially a predictable and transparent process. How do we go about building things? Where can we just eliminate steps entirely in our processes as we move forward? And then you're taking that, and once the process is evident and you can look at it and you can see where it works and where it doesn't, then you can begin really tuning at the lower levels and eliminating waste. Making sure you're delivering the same output with less effort. But again, that's tertiary. It's not all about waste reduction. That's just a little piece of the puzzle there. And from a lean startup perspective, you're kind of changing the way you view running projects. It's away from just building things and trying to get stuff out the door, and it's towards mitigating risks of various sorts. So we're saying here that our risks may differ over the course of the project and depending on what sort of product we're building. If we're building, let's say, General Dynamics, for instance, you might already have an existing product line. There may be a big customer base. And so finding the customers may not be the issue, in fact. Now we're trying to find other market elements that we can introduce to them, other offerings that address new problems they might have. If we're doing a startup, well, just getting people to recognize that we exist is a problem in the first place. Let's make sure there is a market, there are customers, there is actually a problem we're trying to solve. So as you move through the product, the things you're building are really quite directly addressing various sorts of risks of this sort. And that's what your hypotheses are trying to cast, is what is the nature of the risk and why do we think that building this particular feature, for our instance, would help to alleviate a given one. And so a lot of it comes down to actually developing paths to your customers in the first place. How do we talk to them? We can go watch them. We can interview them. We're trying to establish an ability to very quickly move things forward. Have any of you ever heard the story of Flickr? You know what Flickr is, of course, photo sharing site. How did it come around? Ever heard this? No. A company called Ludicore actually originally was building a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. They called it The Game Never Ending. And when they were building this game, they had a very tight rapport with their customer base, with their users on a forum. They interacted with them quite a lot and said, what do you want to see in the game? And when the customer said something, they built it. They built it fast. They built and released new features 3 and 4 times a day. Okay? So they actually developed a one-button rollout, one-button rollback capability. So, you know, obviously very, very quick iteration of this product. Turns out one of the little features they built in this product was a Flash-based photo sharing client. And for whatever reason, lots of people were very interested in this. They kept asking for new features until finally the guys at the top said, wow, this thing's taken on a life of its own. They spun it off into a whole separate product. They re-architected it in PHP. They called it Flickr. 13 months later, sold to Yahoo, $34 million, 13th ranked site on the web. Now, this is interesting because this was not a product idea. Okay? It wasn't. It was just a little side feature, a little sideshow. The entire ability, the reason it came into existence is because they were able to talk to the users, and they did, and they were able to react and build things quickly enough that that the product was able to grow directly based on the user's feedback. That's not the way to grow every product for sure, but having that ability is core, which is of course where a lot of the agile stuff comes in to let you do the release and the building and development rapidly in that fashion. You know, and how are you getting to the customers? Well, there are a whole host of ways to do this. Most of these aren't terribly new. The get out of the building thing is, you know, I learned about this from the first days of doing user experience work. It's anthropology is what it amounts to. You're watching people in their native environment. In lean areas, they talk about going to the gemba. What does that mean? It means the supervisors of a given process go to the shop floor. They actually see how their guys do it. They participate in it sometimes, and they learn it, the essence of it, for themselves, because they can't know how to improve it otherwise. And they talk about getting out of the building in the lean startup canon. It's the same deal, right? We're trying to go and really see people in their native environment rather than trusting their word about how they think they work. People never work how they think they work. This is a bit of again, not a new concept, but a new term, one I hadn't heard previously, the idea of concierge prototyping, essentially. Anybody know what this is? What is that?
They presented it last time.
Oh, they
basically, you go through and you run everybody to do it manually until you can figure out what you're going to run.
Yeah, I mean, this could be anything from, it's a little beyond paper prototyping. It's really simulating a whole process manually and pretending, in fact, it's a real thing. I was at a lean startup conference, in fact, down in San Francisco a few months back, and they had a lady from General Electric presenting on one of their products, and she was talking about, no, this was a different one. This was Intuit. A manager in India had been given a mandate to go out there and make India better. He's like, wow, that's quite a broad mission there, isn't it? So he had to figure out what he was actually going to go do. And he went out there and they did some investigation. What are some of the needs out here? What can we realistically achieve in a reasonable time frame? He had a sum total of 30 people, right, that they had given him in the entire India division. It was like India or Intuit Global Services or some such. And basically, they came down to this. We're going to help farmers find, basically markets for their crops. Where can they go and sell them best? Where the price is best? And cell phones are ubiquitous in India. So what they initially did were they would just basically manually copy down the stock reports for the day or the pricing at various markets, and they would just manually send out text messages to the farmers to see how they would react. And of course, they got a lot of uptake on it, and they gradually built that into an application. But that's concierge planning. If, of course, no one had any uptake on that, or they weren't interested in it, there would have been no reason to go build an application. They wouldn't have done it. They would have tried something a little different before they sunk their cost in. So nothing more here than learning in the quickest, cheapest way possible. If you could do it with a sketch on a whiteboard or a paper prototype or whatever, that's what you're going to do. If you have to build software to get deeper, then that's what you're going to do. And then, of course, going and evaluating things over time. So that's qualitative side of things. That's subjective to some degree. There's also a lot of truly data-based decision making taking place in most lean startup environments. Rather than trusting your gut, for instance, about what layout of a given page is going to be the best, if your team can't agree on it, well, you might choose, in fact, to launch both in parallel. Let's put them out there. Let's randomly serve up half the one version to one group of people will come, and the other half of the folks who arrive will get the other version. We'll simply observe it over a bit of time, see which one works best, and decommission the other one. So that's A/B testing, split testing, the various ways to go about that, but it's trying to create controlled experiments over fairly short periods of time that allow you, in fact, to figure out which version works best without choosing up front. So all this comes in, we're going, and this is an example of a tool called a story map, just a way to lay out a release roadmap, essentially. But we're trying to say, let's start with a basic version here. The walking skeleton is an old term that's been used from the Agile days. Lean startup, same idea. What do they call it in lean startup? The first release. The MVP, right? The minimum viable product. It's the exact same idea. We're trying to build something that'll prove or disprove our original idea, our hypothesis. Let us get a sense of if we really do know who our customers are, we're targeting the wrong people. Allow us to set up a base product that we can evolve, and so on. And then we begin to, of course, shift in subsequent releases to different variations, deepening some features and perhaps changing the way we approached others based on the feedback we received in the first. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit more about MVP? I mean, I find it a very subjective call.
It is a very subjective call. It's let me hold that for 1 second, because I'm gonna hit it from a couple angles here in just a second, but well, definitely. The one other tool that's very popular here, and you'll see a nice real one in Casey's presentation. It's called the Lean Canvas. This is actually really a derivation of, again, an old lean concept called A3 planning. And this boiled down to taking one sheet of paper, international paper size, A3 originally. They use A4 sheets these days. But they tried to get, let's say, someone who was coming up with a new product idea, a new car at Toyota. They say you have to capture the differentiators, the market, the rationale really behind you building this car on one sheet of paper. Now, it wasn't actually A3 planning wasn't quite as structured as this, or not as consistent, because from one car to the next, you could have wildly different looking canvases. They were quite often big illustrations and things of that nature, not just textual information. The Lean Canvas takes a lot of the core elements that you'd find in something like, again, a project chart or even a business case, and lays it out in one page here, forcing you to really boil down the core elements of why you think your product's a good idea, what the problems are it's solving, the customers it's solving them for, and some information about, in fact, how you get it out to the market and make money from it. So I'll leave the details of that to Casey, but it's a convenient way to, in fact, it's a tool to help you craft your release plans, really, in a sense. It says, are we on the right track here? When we begin on our next stage of this product, do we need to change something here? Perhaps one of our assumptions was, in fact, untrue, and we need to change it so that we can make the next release better. There are also some focus from the quantitative side on these, the so-called pirate metrics, called the pirate metrics because the initial letters there, right, form a nice R. Yeah, there we got the idea that it's looking at some common characteristics of things that are interesting from a customer perspective. We want to know when or how do people find us. Acquisition metrics are people have arrived, we have new users. Right? Activation metrics are, we have new users and they've actually done what they're supposed to do with our product. They've had a successful kind of walkthrough and whatever the core use case is, so to speak, in the product, they've done that. Retention is, and they've kept doing it, right, for a while now. And usually we're tracking groups of people here in what we call cohorts, which is essentially people who arrive at the same time. Everybody who signed up May 1st on your product, we're tracking their experience from then till, in December we released some, brand new feature. And it turns out some of those people in May didn't like the new feature and they left. The people who just arrived in December never saw the old features to begin with, so there's no change. That's why we're trying to track people by their arrival groups, if you will. And retention is one of the more ongoing, one of the ones with more ongoing utility of these metrics. Your revenue, of course, is monetary events here, and referral is they tell their friends about it. This is actually an example lean canvas from the tool that we built called Sensei. It's a retrospective tool out there, free for you guys to try it. SenseiTool.com, by the way, if you'd like to. And just gives you an example of what we're walking through here. And again, I'll skip this for the moment because Casey's got a richer, better one with a bigger product. This is an example of how you're actually using this canvas and some of these metrics you're gathering to help you, in fact, guide your decisions and your so-called pivots. What do we want to change? Well, we've got a hypothesis. We've got the outcomes of, in fact, these little experiments we're running. We ran a sprint. We tested some things with some people. What happened? How did it change our metrics? Did we learn anything that would cause us to change our plan going forward? That's what it amounts to. And this is just an example also of a so-called Kanban board. How many of you are familiar with Kanban? Okay, good. It really just is showing a progression of things you're building over a series of activities. They have one thing you'll see consistently, you often won't see in other Kanban boards, you will in those in lean startup projects, is this idea of post-release validation. If you're familiar with the concept of, let's say, IV&V, independent verification and validation. Verification is, you did what you said you were going to do. Validation is, and it solved the real problem it was supposed to solve. Of course, not the same thing. So here it's validation. We're trying to go out there and make sure that we're, in fact, really achieving the objectives that we meant to once we release these features. Not just assuming the release is enough by itself. If you think of something like Google Labs, that in its entirety is, in fact, a validation queue. They're looking to make sure that people actually care about the products before they make them into real Google products. And lastly, just a couple of quick notes on how this stuff differs from the startup environment to the big company enterprise environment. Just some examples here. I saw some presentations of several of these folks at the Lean Startup Conference. I found this one particularly interesting, that this guy named Todd Park, new federal CIO, and he has basically done a lot of work with the FDA, launching a big innovation incubator and talking about a number of these things he's doing there. So a little heartening to see the government picking up stuff like this along with the Agile stuff. One of it is, well, it's a change aversion, right? Just in general. It's bad enough everywhere, but it's even worse in a big organization where the change aversion is built into the corporate structures, and managers are scared of losing their power with workers, and workers are scared of losing their positions. So this idea of taking risks in the first place, of building something that in fact people might not like. If you don't build things that people don't like occasionally, you're probably not taking any risks and you're never building anything interesting at all. Right? So there's an idea that we've got to get companies away from the notion that everything must succeed. You've got to have some failures, in fact. We're just trying to mitigate the impact of the failures, and that's much of what the movement is about here. The idea of course, supporting the ability for the company to do lots of these little experiments and changing the way, in some cases, they do, in fact, their financials. Things like capitalization and all of that can have a pretty great impact on how you run these. So the MVPs, and I'm returning now to your topic there. Let me know if I hit the right bit of it. The notion of a minimum viable product is we have a core hypothesis here. We say, I'll use our tool as an example. We say that teams have trouble basically doing retrospectives where they track the impacts of their actions. Okay, so they do retrospectives, but they just turn into complaint sessions. They just sit there and whine to each other for a while and never actually improve their processes, which is the ostensible reason the retrospective exists in the first place. So in an MVP, you would release it, in fact, to identify, are there really people who feel like that's their problem? And if you release it and they don't think that, well, you're going to do another release and try to change things, or you're just going to cancel it. So an MVP is meant to give you just enough information to let you understand that you ought to take the next step. In a broad sense, it's the problem you think exists does exist, and some sense that it has enough scale to support whatever business case you've got out there. Let me put it back to you then.
Usually when we read about it and when people give out examples, it ends up being, I have this app, I'm going to put it out, my early adopters are going to give me feedback. How do you take this to something which is more critical, like if my product is a pacemaker, or if Boeing were to do lean startup in case of the Dreamliner, what would be their MVP?
Well, the Dreamliner, for instance, I think really you're looking at the deltas there, right? For something big like that, for something like a pacemaker, maybe you would try to do something that use less power, let's say, some renewable energy source or something like that. You would try to probably bound off the areas of critical impact like that. You're not gonna actually put it in a person right now. Right? You're gonna hook it up to some sort of a voltage meter or something and put it in the environment and test it like that. So it really would be effectively a prototype that tested whatever the core differentiating feature is, maybe not everything, right? And you try to really bound off those other aspects and address them later. Because you don't care about anything that's rote, anything that's well understood already. Like let's say the pacemaker enclosure was not going to change. Yeah, you wouldn't even worry about that, right? I mean, you would just fake the enclosure or just go with an old one or existing one or whatever, because all you care about is your new power source. That's really the thing that you're trying that's new and weird and different. So I view them in that way. I mean, you're not, if it's life critical, mission critical, you're trying to test an environment that wouldn't actually expose it to those things in the early stages, probably. Is there a particular example other than that you might have in mind? Or?
No, the amount of reading I've done on MVP always tends to take examples which, if they fail tomorrow, doesn't make a difference to anybody's life.
Yeah, I mean, and I think really that's because of the genesis of the movement, frankly. It's a Silicon Valley thing.
Right.
Certainly you come to these meetings, still plenty of entrepreneurs, right? There are lots of startups. So it's,
I don't care.
I think as time goes on, that'll change.
Yeah.
You know, you'll see more rich examples.
So
Yeah,
for
but
an example of pacemaker, think about the time when there was no pacemaker.
Yeah.
So you're inventing a pacemaker, and at that time, there's no pacemaker there. So this is what you will create something that you can experiment with. Maybe you will experiment with only certain type of patients, but you using that to improve upon something may not fit. I may be wrong.
yeah, well, I mean, a drug company, for instance, introducing some radical new treatment for a fatal disease.
Right.
Well, the early adopters are people who might be willing to try that, regardless of the impact, because the alternative is death, right? I mean, so in that case, really, you don't have a lot of opportunities. That's a bit of an extreme example, but early adopters quite often have a real hunger. Theoretically, they have a real hunger for what you're offering here. That's why they're an early adopter. Therefore, they're willing to be a little more patient with you. Yeah, they might be otherwise. So the idea of this big company again might worry about, in fact, impacting their brand, impacting their base customers, people they've already got. And there are a lot of different ways you might approach this, depending on the specifics of the situation. But again, you're effectively coordinating it all. I mean, you're saying, look, this is an experiment. If your existing customers, perhaps you can take it or leave it. It's an optional thing. You can sign up for a little beta program, or you can't. Or maybe you just make it an entirely separate brand. That several companies have done that. They said this is in fact an incubator. We're trying some things out here, not really necessarily ready for prime time. But if you're interested, come play with it, and we'll listen to you, and we'll evolve it based upon the things you're telling us. And that, of course, can be very appealing. That real problem. Yeah.
And I asked the exact same question to the Capital One guys last time, because I said, you are a bank. You're probably the last ones to try something risky.
Right.
But if you were to say release an iPhone app using your lead model, I mean, you probably cannot go other brand because people won't trust it if it's not Capital One. But you cannot even have. When do you say that app is MVP? Because it cannot go wrong because it's connected to the big bank reputation.
Well, for instance, like GE with their, if you look at those references I had a few slides ago, think of that ego imagination and such. They've really, it's only been a couple of years too. They've got probably 20 some odd apps, or if not more, for each of those. There's eco imagination and healthy imagination, two separate units, and they're really lots of very, very tightly focused things, and that's part of it. Right, I mean, they're not big, massive apps. They're very targeted things that just address very specific needs, which I think probably makes it a little simpler to, in fact, make them ready for prime time out there. Really, I think what they're trying to do is they're testing it internally. They're testing it with some, focus group type things, and then at some point they're saying, okay, it's a real need, and really then it being treating it like a normal development project with the same quality metrics you might have otherwise. And really, yes, sir.
Segmentation is one way of doing it.
Yeah, you segment your customer bases.
Well, one of the things that I think, just using a lot of these banking apps, I think every one of those is an MVP. I mean, none of them really are feature rich, right?
Yeah.
They keep it simple, and I think that's how they mitigate the risk, because you're right, they can't afford to screw up.
Yeah. I mean, and when I see about apps, it's kind of just in the way that they exist. They're already often very tightly focused things, right? People already
At some point, you
expect
have to
them
go
to
to
be.
the desktop to actually get the job done.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I also think that one of the key phrases they use with MVP is that it's to test a hypothesis, which doesn't mean that it's the entire product, right? And so it doesn't have to be that you're releasing it out to the entire market. It's what is the MVP to our testers, right? Or what it is to our pilot group. And that's where it's not just an MVP to everybody, but it's MVP to a certain stage of things.
Yeah.
I wonder if, especially in enterprise, once they validate the hypothesis, they may just throw away whatever they did and restart and do it through the regular channels. So I don't know.
They may. Yeah, I mean, I think Smith's not close to it.
You guys don't.
We can't afford to.
As long as you got something, you just build it right to begin with.
That's right.
So, last bit, again, just the budgeting side of things, right? That we've got to move away from, the long term. Here's our annual budget. You've got to tell us everything you're doing next year, down to the last feature in detail. Obviously, that's not going to support lots of these short-term little experiments where we come up with something and in a few months we've already, in fact, built it, several versions of it, twisted it around 180 degrees from what it started with, and then released it. You've got to have a more adaptive kind of cycle here, and more relative project goals too. That is, instead of just doing this and it has to do that or it's a failed project, we actually may, in fact, move the target a little bit based on what we're learning. So that's it. And you can go into a lot of this ideas of innovation accounting be a different way to approach the financials, and I'm sure you've read about sustaining versus disruptive innovations. If you're building on an existing thing versus entering a whole new market, there's a different way you got to approach the project, right? I mean, it's a different sort of situation. And that's it. You're interested. Any comments? Anything I missed there you guys would like to see in an introductory presentation? I'm just curious.
I think it's excellent.
But
Yeah.
You tied together a lot of good examples
Good deal.
of work, and it gave me a lot of things to look up on the web.
Perfect. All right. Well, I'm gonna hand it over. Do we want to? Maybe we take like a 5-minute.